we're gonna do chapter 3. Woohoo! Oops. As soon as I can figure out where to get you. There we go. Put you on a book. Okay, chapter 3. Dog is not here anymore. Islam. Section 1. September 11th, 2001. Exactly 316 years to the day after Muslim invaders were turned away at the gates of Vienna, Austria. The world watched in horror as 4 commercial airliners were mutated into flying missiles in the service of radical Islamist ideology. On each flight, hijackers used knives or box cutters, mace, and pepper spray to keep passengers at bay, threatening to detonate bombs if anyone tried to fight back. Little did the passengers suspect the planes themselves would become the bombs. At 8:14 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a non-stop flight from Boston to Los Angeles, was the first to be hijacked. 5 armed men murdered several people on the flight before ramming the plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City 32 minutes later. United Airlines Flight 175, also bound for Los Angeles, was similarly hijacked at approximately 8:45 a.m. 15 minutes later, one brave passenger, Peter, risked a call to his father. "It's getting bad, Dad. A stewardess was stabbed. They seem to have knives and mace. They said they have a bomb. It's getting very bad on the plane. Passengers are throwing up and getting sick. The plane is making jerky movements. I don't think the pilot is flying the plane. I think we're going down. I think they intend to go to Chicago or someplace and fly into a building. Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be very fast." As the phone connection abruptly ended at 9:03 a.m., Peter's father witnessed Flight 175 crash into the World Trade Center's South Tower, instantly immolating all on board and untold numbers in the building. American Airlines Flight 77, departing from Washington, D.C. and also intended for Los Angeles, was hijacked minutes before 9 a.m. and 30 minutes later crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93, departing Newark, New Jersey for San Francisco, left 25 minutes behind schedule, and approximately 46 minutes into the flight, the hijackers gained control of the cockpit. Some of the passengers phoned loved ones and heard of the other attacks. Recognizing the likely intentions of their own aircraft's hijackers, they stormed the cockpit. Their efforts were in vain, however. United Flight 93 plowed into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 580 miles per hour, about 20 minutes flying time from Washington, D.C. In the course of one day, Americans became tragically aware that they had been asleep while a very powerful worldview emerged from a centuries-long slumber in a bid for global power. Shocked and angered, the nation was asking what kind of people would sacrifice their lives to kill as many possible. The answer was discovered almost immediately. The hijackers were all Saudi and Egyptian Muslim men. If all the terrorists were Muslim, Americans wondered, might any Muslim be a terrorist? Muslim Americans wondered if their neighbors would seek revenge on all Muslims, including those not prone to violence. Section 2. Radical versus Moderate. Those who observed the events of September 11th, 2001, especially those who lost loved ones, find it difficult to view Islam outside the prism of their experience. If we are to understand the worldview of Islam on its own terms, though, we need to seek to understand what Islam says about itself and not just rely on our visceral reactions. Violent, radical Muslims who dream of establishing a global Islamic state and are willing to use violence to achieve this end do exist. Most Muslims, though, simply want to engage in Muslim practices and raise their families according to Muslim traditions. They hope more people will convert to Islam, but they have little interest in establishing a global Islamic state if it is going to involve violence or tearing down the structure of democracy from which they have obtained personal benefit. Such Muslims are often called moderates. This is not to imply that they are less devout, but rather that they welcome building economic ties with the West instead of destroying it. In any event, distinguishing between moderate and radical Muslims is not easy. In the respected Foreign Policy magazine, John L. Esposito and Dahlia Mogahed summarized research conducted by the Gallup Corporation. The research revealed substantive errors in what Americans think about radical Islam. Radicals, in fact, are not more likely to attend religious services than moderates. They earn more money and stay in school longer than moderates, and they express more satisfaction with their financial situations. They are also as likely as moderates to express admiration of the West's technology, democracy, and freedom of speech. The researchers wrote, "We find that Muslim radicals have more in common with their moderate brethren than is often assumed. If the West wants to reach the extremists and empower the moderate Muslim majority, it must first recognize who it's up against." This astounding statement would be rejected out of hand were it not for the researchers' credentials. Esposito is a respected professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University, and Mogahed is one of the most influential Muslim women in the world. The key difference between moderate and radical Muslims is this: radicals are more likely to believe that the West threatens and attempts to control their way of life. So, how can we tell the difference between moderates and radicals? Gallup asked Muslims in several countries whether they thought the 9/11 attacks were justified, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 was totally unjustified and 5 was completely justified. Those who answered 4 or 5 were defined as radical. Only 7% of Muslims fit this designation, but with more than 1.6 billion Muslims in the world today, this means there could be at least 112 million radical Muslims. Section 3, Should We Be Afraid? At 7:15 p.m. on November 4, 2004, armed guards wearing bulletproof vests and carrying machine guns surrounded Geert Wilders and announced, "You will have to leave at once." Shoving him into an armored car, the men told him he was in extreme danger of being assassinated and would have to stay in a safe house until further notice. Since that day, Wilders, a high-level political leader, hasn't been home. He cannot go out in public without a bulletproof vest and a contingent of armed guards. Word of these death threats against Wilders and a colleague, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, immediately reached the news media, which reported that anti-Muslim politicians had gone into hiding. Wilders' crime? In a speech, he stated that the existence of peaceful Muslims should not blind us to the fact that Islam is a violent ideology that should be rejected by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Wilders was not in Afghanistan or even Iraq, but in the Netherlands. His experience is discomforting because it points to a substantial problem Westerners face. As Islam grows, more and more people are discovering Islam as an ideology, a worldview that by its nature demands political control at the expense of democracy, freedom, and constitutional government. And yet we're conflicted. We have Muslim neighbors who work hard, get along with others, and are peaceful, law-abiding citizens. So which is it? Is Islam, as Wilders describes it, a violent ideology waiting to subvert the West, or a peaceful religion with more than 1 billion adherents? We think the question can only be answered by viewing Islam as a worldview, a pattern of ideas, beliefs, convictions, and habits. More than that, though, we need to understand that Islam is a system of practices by which Muslims believe they demonstrate submission to Allah. By understanding Islam's founding principles, sources of revelation, and key teachings as a complete worldview, we will perceive Islam more clearly and know how to respond biblically. According to M. Zudi Jasir, a Muslim medical doctor and a U.S. Navy veteran, it is helpful to distinguish between two groups, Muslims and Islamists. Muslims are people who are culturally Islamic. They were born into Muslim families or converted to Islam and identify with Islamic culture and try to follow its practices. Muslims take Islam seriously, but they can get along with non-Muslims and can live comfortably in societies that are not Islamic in nature. Islamists, sometimes called Islamic fundamentalists, are radicals who believe in the literal application of the teachings of Muhammad and the full application of Sharia law, the moral code of Islam outlined in the Quran and other teachings and rulings Muslims consider authoritative. Sharia law governs everything from diet and sexual practices to the punishment of crime. Many of its aspects are shockingly harsh, legitimizing slavery, advocating physical abuse of wives, demanding heavy taxation of Christians and Jews living in Muslim lands, and calling for the killing of Muslims who convert to another faith. Muslims and Islamists seem to differ in their understanding of jihad. Jihad means to fight against non-Muslims, and it is clearly commanded of all Muslims in the Quran. Muslims see jihad as a battle to discipline themselves, or perhaps a call to defend themselves against those who attack Islam. Islamists, on the other hand, see jihad as it was historically seen, as a conquest of non-believing nations. To the Muslim way of thinking, the world was originally Islamic and every person was born a Muslim. Those who are not now Muslims are in rebellion. To Islamists, the use of force is justified against such rebellion. Usually this takes the form of a strict application of Sharia law and strident education campaigns to win converts and inspire nominal Muslims to be more Islamist. Some think there is a third category of Muslims, jihadis. According to Nabil Qureshi, a convert from Islam to Christianity, who upon graduation from medical school became an evangelist rather than a physician, jihadis are Islamists who have crossed the line into weaponizing their beliefs. By committing themselves to physical violence, jihadis have made themselves into a sort of army dedicated to destroying the West. While Western Muslims say jihad is only for defensive purposes, jihadis include as legitimate defense anything that conquers the world's resistance to Islam becoming a global civilization. They believe the use of physical force and terror in the pursuit of jihad entirely called for, and peace with Islam will occur only when non-believers submit. While Islamists might not participate in overt violence, many tacitly approve of these techniques. One difficulty in the Islamic faith is that jihad is required of all Muslims and is always described in a warlike fashion. Would-be moderate Muslims are presented with a serious dilemma. Do they participate in jihad by warring against their neighbors, ignore it, or explain it as a form of personal self-discipline that has nothing to do with warfare? Those in the group we've called Muslim, as opposed to Islamists and jihadis, mostly try to reinterpret the meaning of jihad as a form of personal discipline, or they just ignore the concept altogether. In fact, as strongly as many Muslims feel about their Islamic identity, they simply do not follow through with Muslim practices. As Abdu Murray, a former Muslim and leader of Aletheia International, says, most Muslims simply do not adhere to many of the commands of Islamic scripture. I can't tell you how many Muslims are nominal at best, he notes. They are only cultural Muslims. If it were a crime to be an Orthodox Muslim, they couldn't be convicted of it. They hold their worldview with a varying degree of tightness. Because of the explicit aims of Islamists, many people dread Islam's growth. Many Christians hold this view, as do adherents of other worldviews. Many Muslims are afraid as well. They disagree with radicalism but refuse to vocalize their true beliefs so as not to dishonor their families or undermine their religious leaders. Salman Rushdie, a Muslim novelist who has lived under threat of death for decades because he spoke out against radical Islam, said, "The trouble with fear is that it's not susceptible to reason. You can say to people, here are 72 reasons not to be afraid, and they'll say, yeah, but I'm still scared." Fear is one thing we must never give into, and only one thing makes it go away: love. Perfect love casts out fear. When we are filled with love, even tough love, we gain fortitude. Love can transform fear into moral courage. Reason alone cannot. From the standpoint of love, we can see Islam as a worldview as diverse as Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, or Hinduism, with factions, differing convictions, and varying levels of commitment. We engage it with the gospel just as we engage other worldviews. Section 4. The history of Islam. Islam means submission. A Muslim is one who submits to Allah and the principles of Islam as embodied in the Ummah, the worldwide community of Muslims. The Ummah is a very strong force for Muslims, binding together religious commands, ideology, and cultural practices, providing both a comforting sense of belonging and a reassuring hierarchy. Children are subject to adults, women to men, the individual family to community leaders, and community leaders to the Islamic State. Individual identity and interest are subordinated. The Ummah, though not a formal structure, exerts enormous power. It is something Muslims do not want to upset or disagree with or offend. To break away from it is to be alienated and lost. Today, Islam is a major world religion, boasting a membership of nearly 1/4 of the world's population. The majority of Muslims are not Arabs. The largest Muslim populations in the world reside in Indonesia, followed by Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Nearly half of the world's Muslim population lives in these 4 countries. The founder of Islam was Muhammad. According to the Islamic narrative, he was born around AD 570 in Mecca, or modern-day Saudi Arabia. The city's culture at that time was characterized by polytheism, which is the belief in many deities, and animism, which is the belief that various spirits inhabit plants, animals, and other objects in the world. As a merchant, Muhammad also regularly encountered the monotheism of Jews and Christians. When he was around 40 years of age, Muhammad became troubled by a series of visions he thought were demonic. One of his wives, Khadija, persuaded him to think that the visions were from God. In AD 610, according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad claimed the angel Gabriel visited him and commissioned him as a prophet of God. He spent the next several years transmitting the message orally into what Muslims consider the most pure understanding of God, the Holy Quran. The message Muhammad said God gave him was simple and elegant. There is one God who made all things, to whom all people must submit, and there will be a day of judgment in which all humans will be judged according to their deeds, both good and evil. Muhammad believed Islam to be the final, all-encompassing religion God was giving humankind. The dictation of the Quran continued for 23 years until Muhammad's death in AD 632. By the early 7th century, Mecca was a trading center of great religious, economic, and political power on the Arabian Peninsula. It boasted the Kaaba, a large black box-like building that contained 360 tribal deities, so it was a temple, including statues of Mary and Jesus, which various tribes placed there on their regular pilgrimages to the city. According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad proclaimed these tribal gods to be an offense to God, igniting a controversy that threatened the wealthy city's stability. At first, Muhammad expressed reluctance to confront Mecca's leaders, but he overcame his bashfulness through subsequent visions. Inevitably, Muhammad's teachings led to a clash with Meccan leaders. In AD 622, Muhammad fled to Medina, also known as Yathrib, an event known to Muslims as Hijra, the migration that began the Muslim era and the Islamic calendar. From Medina, Muhammad's followers, known today as Muslims, began raiding merchant caravans to gain wealth. Early victories, like the one at the Battle of Badr in AD 624, in which 324 Muslims were said to have defeated a Meccan force 3 times their number, added to the perception that Islam was indeed God's will. 2 years later, Muslims repelled a Meccan attack on Medina in the Battle of Al-Azab. The following year, Muhammad agreed to a treaty with Meccan leaders permitting him to enter the city as a pilgrim. On January 11th of AD 629, Muhammad and about 10,000 warriors captured Mecca and cleansed the Kaaba of its idols. Today, Mecca is Islam's most holy place. Muhammad and his followers continued to spread Islam by conquering the surrounding areas. Within 100 years of its founding, Islam had subjugated parts of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa through military conquest. Literally tens of millions, including Christians, were taken into slavery or killed. American President Teddy Roosevelt, in his 1916 book, Fear God and Take Your Own Part, wrote, "Whatever the Mohammedans have had a complete sway, or wherever they have had complete sway, wherever the Christians have been unable to resist them by the sword, Christianity has ultimately disappeared." When Muhammad died in AD 632, three caliphs or successors took his place. Later, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, took power. The murder of Ali in AD 661 is the root of a conflict that rages still. Those who insisted the successor should be elected by popular vote became the Sunni Muslims. Currently, about 80% of Muslims worldwide hold to Sunni Islam. The Shiite faction, these are Muslims, the Shiite Muslims, however, believe the successor should be someone from the bloodline of the Muhammad, a family member or descendant. Shiite Islam, or Shia Islam, is a powerful force among Muslims, especially following the 1979 revolution when the Ayatollah Khomeini gained control of the country of Iran. Shiites remain a majority in Iran, and significant communities of Shiites persist in Iraq and other countries. While they agree that no prophets can succeed Muhammad, Shiites have leaders called imams, whom they believe God has gifted to guide Muslims. Sunnis also have imams, but they are more lay leaders. Sunnis and Shiites agree on the importance of the Quran, but acknowledge differing collections of Muhammad's sayings and teachings. Sufi Islam arose in protest to the worldliness overtaking Islam in its early days, when the wealth and power gained through military conquest seemed to compromise religious commitment. Sufism gradually gained attention through the writings of the famous Sufi scholar Al-Ghazali, who spread spiritual renewal among the Muslim people. In contrast to the majority Muslim belief that Allah reveals only His will but not His personal nature, Sufism advocates a personal experience and oneness with Allah that sometimes borders on pantheism. The result is a lively, less legalistic form of Islam. Sufism has been, and sometimes continues to be, fascinating to many Westerners. This is especially true of the writings of its famous poets such as Jalal al-Din Rumi. Islam also has many smaller offshoots. While Orthodox Islam holds that Muhammad was the final prophet in a long succession of prophets, some groups claim that other prophets since Muhammad have come. The Baha'i world faith was established in 1844 and boasts the prophet Baha'u'llah. The Nation of Islam, known as the Black Muslims, is a racially motivated offshoot of Islam founded by Elijah Muhammad, whom his followers considered to be a modern-day prophet. Mainstream Islam rejects both the Nation of Islam and Baha'i. Section 5. Sorry about that. Irshad Manji is one of a kind, a Canadian woman and lesbian activist who was raised Muslim and still claims an Islamic faith. Manji is the object of scorn among Muslims and a curiosity to everyone else. Sassy and vulnerable in her writing and speaking, Manji readily admits her weaknesses and inconsistencies and vigorously expresses the weaknesses and inconsistencies of Islam itself. For Manji, the problem of Islam is its limits on individual freedom. The only force, she believes, that would move the world beyond the religious conflict of our age. She identifies three problems preventing Islam from coexisting peacefully with Christianity and secularism. 1. Uniformity. To maintain unity, Muslim leaders demand uniformity. Thinking differently instigates the crumbling of empire. 2. Suppression of disagreement. Discussing problems openly is seen as a display of weakness. Debate brings about fissures. Fissures divide, thus debate amounts to division. And 3. Elimination of critical thought. Thinking differently is dangerous in Islam, says Manji. When leaders settled on particular interpretations of Muhammad's teachings, the very idea of innovation became criminalized. Manji insists she is not advocating the diminishment of Islamic community. I'm arguing for individuality, not individualism, she says. Most Muslims, though, see that as a distinction without a difference. They have refused to rally to her point of view. Manji and those who agree with her are right about at least one thing. Unthinking allegiance is the temptation of every worldview, even those that claim to value free thought. When people allow others to think for them, they essentially set up those others as idols. The Bible, on the other hand, repeatedly emphasizes loving God with one's mind, being prepared to give an answer, and not being deceived by wrong philosophies. While Muslim scholars may debate about whether there is room for different interpretations of Muhammad's teachings, Islam is nevertheless best understood as a comprehensive worldview. Salim Azam, the Secretary General of the Islamic Council of Europe, explains, Islam does not divide life into domains of the spiritual and the secular. It spiritualizes the entire existence of man and produces a social movement to reconstruct human life in the light of principles revealed by God. Prayer and worship in Islam are means to prepare man to fulfill his mission. Islam aims at changing life and producing a new man and a new society, both committed to God and to the welfare of mankind. That is why Islam is not a religion in the limited sense of the word. Rather, it is a complete code of life and a culture-producing factor. Urbain Vermeulen, former president of the European Union of Arabists and Islamicists, states simply, in Islam, you can't eat a la carte. You have to take the whole menu. So what is the whole menu? Let's have a look at what Islam teaches about God, the Bible, Jesus, salvation, and judgment. And that's where we're going to stop.